often I'll hear people who don't believe in the Bible, just give me one little simple proof. They're looking for all this, just one closing slam dunk argument. And then the more I listen to brilliant men like yourself and others from their different persuasions, whether it's an astrophysicist, whether it's, they need time to build the evidence.
Yeah.
But a sharp person should listen.
Well, that's hard because let's face it, most of the objections we're going to hear from our friends are rhetorically powerful and usually short. We're in a culture where everything has to be done in 140 characters. So the objection that can be leveled in 140 characters but requires a cumulative circumstantial response is a tough position to be in as a Christian. But this is the nature of every criminal case, is that this is how we make cases. And so if we're going to have confidence that we're beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal cases that we make with a cumulative circumstantial case, I think we can have confidence in this too. So for me, looking at the Gospels, once I determined that they were reliable, remember, Gospels are a form of, at least originally, were direct testimony, the direct testimony of eyewitnesses. That's called direct evidence. Everything else falls in the indirect or circumstantial category. People don't realize that. Oh, I need direct, well, a piece of DNA at a crime scene does not necessarily mean what you think it means. That suspect is there, obviously his DNA is there. But if you interview him and he tells you, well, yeah, we've been living together for the last 5 years, the circumstance is going to change the power of that DNA. It's meaningless now because he's been living there for 5 years. So everything else falls in the circumstantial category, the indirect category. So as I got interested and I evaluated the Gospels, direct evidence, using that template we've been talking about, it really got me to a place where I was like, I'm stuck with this Jesus guy. I mean, these accounts, I think, of whatever way you can possibly measure them, they measure well. They actually hold up pretty well. So now I'm stuck with, well, I've never really accepted that God exists. But this claim suggests something supernatural happened that really can only be explained through the existence of God. So now I have to go back and look at the case for God's existence. And I think we build that case. That is built really in a circumstantial way. Many people will love one particular line of evidence over another, and they might say, hey, you know, this is the deal killer. This one piece is going to convince you. Well, I very seldom anymore will say to somebody, I'm going to prove this to you. I'm going to provide you with the evidence that I felt was convincing, that was persuasive. Whether that proves anything to you, there's a whole other set of dynamics. It's about your presuppositions. It's about whatever is driving, if it's volitional, emotional, rational. Lots of other things are driving that. So I typically will be more modest in my entry by saying, hey, I'm going to provide for you the evidence that was persuasive for me. And for me, there was a very persuasive circumstantial case that supported God's existence. I mean, I think the evidence from science dictates that we really do live in a universe that has a beginning. That is the overwhelming consensus of what is called the standard cosmological model. It's a model that says that everything came into existence from nothing at a fixed point in the past. Now, we can argue about how far in the past that thing was, but we all agree, and science agrees with us, for many reasons, many lines of evidence that point to the same conclusion. By the way, people who believe that the standard cosmological model, even non-Christians, who accept that model, that everything came from nothing at a point in the distant past, they believe that based on a cumulative circumstantial case. They look at the existence of an expanding universe, and they kind of think backwards in time. That means it must have started from some point. They look at the second law of thermodynamics and realize we still have some usable energy in a universe that if it was eternally old, why would we still have any energy left? We should have run out of it by now. There's a sense that we're in a wind-up universe that at some point in the fixed past had a point of tight winding. So there's a sense that that second law of thermodynamics also points to a universe that seems to match what we see in the expanding universe. We see a radiation echo that seems to be best explained as the radiation glow aftermath of that initial expansion event. We have a sense of something called the philosophy of infinite regress, which basically demonstrates it's impossible to have an infinite set of sequential events in the past. And basically how I try to explain it is this way. If you're on a racetrack, trying out for a law enforcement agency. I ask you to do a PT test. I want you to run 100 yards in a certain amount of time. And I put you on that track and I point down that track to that 100-yard line and I say, I want you to run that 100-yard line. But every time, just before I pull the starter's pistol, I tell you to move your blocks back 6 inches. And you get all set up again, you're ready to go again, but just before I pull that trigger, move your blocks back 6 inches. If I never let you start, I keep on moving your blocks back 6 inches. Will you ever get to the finish line? No, because I won't let you start. It turns out if the finish line in time is today, I can't get to today unless there's a beginning of time.
Right.
A starting line from which I can run to get to this point. So even without the scientific evidence, the observational evidence of looking at an expanding universe, which we see from redshifting, we see it observationally through our telescopes. If we didn't have any of that, I'd have good philosophical reasons to believe we're in a universe that has a beginning. So I think that's one piece of evidence. We're in a universe that has a beginning, and we all know from causal factors, the principle of causality, that anything that has a beginning must have a beginner. Something that begins. If you walk in this room and you see a soccer ball rolling across the room and you're the first person in the room, you're going to look to see who kicked it. Because you know that that thing that began to move had to have a beginner to move it.
Right.
Of course, the thing we're looking for that begins all space, time, and matter, and that's what we're talking about in the universe, all space, time, and matter. If it's going to begin this, if it starts at the beginning of the universe, this thing that begins it cannot be of the same stuff. It's non-spatial, immaterial, atemporal. So whatever starts all space, time, and matter has to be just the opposite, atemporal, immaterial, non-spatial. What is that starting to sound like to you? And so I think as we kind of build a case from cosmology, that's just one piece of our growing circumstantial case we would make, all of which have the best inference, the best explanation is that there's a God who began all of this, who fits the criteria, the description we are looking for, that could be atemporal, non-spatial, immaterial, and start all of this.
You do a lot of talking, too. And do you do debates as well?
You know, I don't do debates, and I'll tell you why I'm a little bit hesitant on debates. There are people out there who are really good, who are my heroes. Folks like William Lane Craig, for instance, as an example. I don't think there's a better debater from the Christian worldview. I mean, there's lots of good debaters. I don't want to take anybody else off that shelf, but I think William Lane Craig is one of the best. I think for me, I have a certain skill set in which I think that what we're doing right now, is probably where my strength is.
Yeah.
The debates also require the rules of debating. And if you're not good at that, you won't be good at the other.
True.
So for me, I try to stay in my lane as a detective. I wouldn't try a case as a debate in front of a jury.
No,
I try it a different way. I present a case, let them present their case, and I try to show where the deficiencies are in that case. And that's kind of the approach I take with people, too. I present my case. I want to hear what the other case is. I'll try to show you where the deficiencies are in that case. But in the end, a juror gets to decide.
I think that's what makes you unique, because just like you're talking to an audience that's here in the studio, you're talking to an audience, you always had to prove it to a jury.
Yeah, exactly. That means in the end, they're not expert. As a matter of fact, if you've got an expert, if you've got a case that's going to be decided on expert DNA evidence, I am typically not going to sit someone in our jury. I'm not going to seat somebody who's a DNA expert. I want to seat just smart lay people. And then we're going to have to communicate, translate that information for them. Well, isn't that our lives as Christians? We might read great books. We might listen to folks like William Lane Craig. But in the end, when we are talking to our buddies at work or at school, we're going to have to find a way to translate those ideas so that our friends, we got to throw the ball in a way they can catch it. Yeah. And so that's a part of it, is just learning how to throw the ball.
We're talking about evidence for God. Now, you were just explaining something. I want you to just start there about truth.
Well, it's something about, you know, when you work homicides, you work in any kind of criminal cases, you're working in a field in which there are laws governing moral behaviors. And so are these laws just conventions of our state, the state I'm working in, or are they actually something that transcends each state? Are they just then the conventions of the government, the federal government, or do these laws actually transcend all governments? So the question I always had was, are there objective moral truth claims that transcend all of us? If there are, where could such things come from? Do we just invent these things ourselves, or do we instead discover something that transcends us, which means it pre-exists us?
Right.
And I have to use a kind of an extreme example here, so please bear with me as I use this extreme example. All of us would agree that we don't torture babies for fun. That's not right.
No.
And I don't care who you are in history, where you are in time, we accept that as a transcendent moral principle.
Yeah.
Now, most of my non-believing friends, and I myself, would have said, well, okay, for number one, either there are no really truly transcendent moral truth claims, or if there are transcendent moral truth claims, I can get to them without God. I would have said, as an atheist, I was a very moral person. I was putting people in jail. My atheist partners, we'd always talk about these folks. I can't tell you how many claim to be Christians. And we would say, hey, we're not the bad guys, we're the good guys. Yep. We're putting bad guys in jail. So we believe that there were transcendent moral truths that we happen to be upholding. The question, of course, is what can best account for those truths? Not that we all recognize them, not that even I would live by them as an atheist. The question is, how did I account for those truths as an atheist? Could my atheism get me there? I would have said, well, look, these are either going to be some part of an evolutionary process in which the species I happen to be, humans, best survive when we embrace or choose to embrace certain moral truths. Therefore, moral truth is simply something that we use. It's utilitarian. And those who have accepted these principles have survived better than those who haven't. Therefore, this group that remains are those that accept these principles. So it's part of an evolutionary process. Or you might say, no, it's actually part of a community, kind of a cultural process in which societies embrace truths for kind of the same benefits that they might offer. So is it a matter of evolution, or is it a matter of cultural convention, or does it come from an objective, transcendent, moral law giver?
Right.
I think as we examine how these things can kind of play out, it's hard to accept the first two explanations. If it's a matter of evolutionary processes, then it means that if you're not on the exact same evolutionary process, there's no reason for you to accept my moral truth claims. You could say, well, you know, Jim, my lineage is different than yours, and my ancestors evolved in a different manner than yours, and where I happen to be today, I disagree with you. Really? Well, I don't think we would ever allow any individual in our culture to say, hey, it might be wrong in your province or in your state to do this, but my evolutionary history is different than yours. Therefore, you got to respect it. How could you not respect my evolutionary? You evolved one way, I evolved another way. Why is yours better than mine? Unless there's something that transcends both of us, in which case evolution can't explain that. The second one might be, well, hey, how do we deal with it? Maybe the culture, maybe just the community decides what's right and wrong. Well, this is something we've kind of seen historically. And Robert Jackson is one of my favorite Supreme Court justices in America. He was one of the few Supreme Court justices who actually had criminal trial attorney experience. He was a criminal prosecutor. As a matter of fact, he served in the hearings that they did with the Nazi war criminals after World War II. At the Nuremberg trials, he was the prosecutor.
Wow.
And each person at the end that these war criminals were brought up, they argued, hey, wait a minute, who do you guys think you are after winning the war to come in here and tell me that this is wrong? In my society, I was actually promoted for these behaviors. This was not seen as who are you now to tell me that this is wrong when the culture I grew up in didn't tell me it was wrong. And in fact, it actually rewarded me. Yeah. We should not be judged by your culture. And Robert Jackson said something that I can't imagine really a Supreme Court justice saying anymore. He said, no. There is a law above the laws. There's a transcendent moral law that transcends all of us. Everyone of the United Nations, everyone across the globe. We might discover it, but we don't invent it. We discover this because it precedes us. It transcends us. And what is the best way to explain this? I think the best and most reasonable inference is that there is a source for this that also transcends and precedes us. And that's why I think this is, yet again, another piece. You build this circumstantial case on a number of different lines of evidence. And by the way, when I have more variety in the lines of evidence, I can have more confidence in the conclusion. So if I have somebody come in and I've got DNA evidence, I've got a witness who says something, I've got fingerprint evidence, the different kinds of evidence make this a very powerful conclusion. If I'm looking at the evidence from science, astrophysics, and cosmology, and I combine it with an argument from design and biology, cosmology, biology, morality, if I combine these different lines of evidence and they all point to the same conclusion, I think we've got good reason to accept that as the most reasonable inference.
That is excellent. That's true, because the Word of God very clearly teaches us we're made in His likeness and image.
Oh, absolutely.
And His words are written.
Yeah, Romans 2.
On our hearts.
How do you explain that any other way? Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
I actually had a guy who taught me forensic statement analysis. I'm sorry, not that. He taught me something called, basically it's a test we used to give. It's kind of like a polygraph test. But it's not done with polygraph, it's done with words. We would record a conversation, and then we would judge if the FM waves would flatten, and your response would tell us if you're lying.
Wow.
But interestingly, he argued as a non-believer. He made it very clear to us he was a non-believer. It's called a voice stress analyzer. He would say this voice stress analyzer works because when you tell somebody a lie, you're afraid of the consequences, and it makes your FM waves flatten. Yet part of the test involved us giving 2 test questions in which we gave the person a permission to lie. I'm going to say this floor is wood, you just say yes. Then I can show him later what his lies look like on the chart.
Right, because there's no punishment for that.
No punishment. Okay, but if I remove the punishment, why does his voice still flatten? The instructor said it shouldn't. It's because of fear of punishment that his voice flattens. I've taken away the punishment. But there's something you know about a lie that still bugs you. And it is reflected in your FM wave. It's Romans 2. is that even if you're a non-believer, even if you've known to reject God's existence, you know right from wrong, because that's a reflection of you having been created in the image of that God. So we're stuck with right and wrong, even if we deny the source of right and wrong.
That is fascinating. Well, in the time we've got left, where do you want to go in helping people to believe in a God?
I think that's something I really am passionate about, and I hope that all of us who are kind of thinking through these processes together accepts our duty as Christians. Most of us would say that, you know, we feel bad that we don't share the gospel enough. You know, none of us are like the Billy Graham of our generation.
Yep.
You know, we're at the market, we share the gospel. We're waiting at a theater, we're sharing the gospel. No, we don't do that. And we feel bad. We think, gosh, you know, I should be more evangelical. I should be more evangelistic. And we don't do it. Well, you know, Paul in Ephesians 4 says that some of us are pastors, some of us are teachers, some of us are evangelists. That means clearly that some of us aren't. Paul seems to recognize that some of us have those gifts and some of us don't. Okay. Peter, so that means you have an option. If you've got those gifts, if God's gifted you that way, get on it. But Peter tells us in 1 Peter 3:15 that all of us need to share our hope in Jesus. Why do we have hope in Jesus? And that's not an option. Not some of you need to share it. No, all of you need to share it. So here's what I want to ask everyone who's listening to this show today. Are you that person? You may not be the evangelist that Billy Graham was, but are you a good Christian case maker? Because we're commanded by God to be that. We can't relegate that to somebody on a TV show, to our pastor. We can't relegate that. Every one of us has to be a case maker because we're called to be that. That's what it is to be a robust, abundant Christian. To be anything less is an abbreviated Christian. To know it's true but not be able to make a case for it, you're only halfway.
Yeah.
We have to go the whole way. So when Peter says that that's a responsibility for all of us, we can all be ready to give the hope we have in Jesus.
Excellent. What book are you working on now?
I'm working on a book that basically looks at the evidence for God's existence, as we've been talking about in this segment, from the crime scene that is the universe. And the same way you might look at a crime scene and ask questions about, can I account for all the evidence in this room by staying in the room? Or do I have to look to an outside intruder to account for this evidence? I think there's good evidence in the universe that can best be accounted for, not from the natural elements of the universe, but from something outside the universe that has to account for that evidence. So we're taking the same look. It's called God's Crime Scene. That's the next book.
Wow, when's it going to be out?
Well, I have to finish it by the end of this year. I'm halfway through.
You're working on it.
As a matter of fact, I was writing before I came to speak to you. So yes, I'm halfway through that book right now.
That's awesome. Where are you going next?
Next, I'm going to in New Jersey at the New Jersey Apologetics Conference tomorrow night. I'm at Liquid Church on Sunday, and then on Monday I'm at Rutgers. And by the way, that's where we can all make the case. If we've got students at the university setting, and you're a parent with those students, that is where the case needs to be made.
Yeah.
And so on the college campuses, like at Rutgers, that's where we need to make a case for biblical reliability. Because I'm telling you, that's where most of our skepticism is allowed to kind of develop and is actually watered. You know, it's kind of fertilized in the university setting. And if we aren't ready to offer a response for the objections they're surely going to hear, because all of us are going to get those objections, it's very hard after the fact to kind of come back to this. But we can do some preventative things. That's kind of inoculation theory. I want the objections that the world is going to offer to come from me as my kid's dad first.
Yes.
Before they hear them out there. I don't want them to hear a new objection for the first time at the university setting. I want to be the source of that objection so I can also offer them why it was not an objection for me anymore.
Right.
So we have to do what I call inoculation theory. We're giving a piece of the thing that's killing you.
Vaccinate them.
And we're vaccinating. And from that, they'll be ready when they hear it out there. They've already heard it. Nothing new here.
That is so wise. The two books I'm holding right here, Cold Case Christianity, and this one, what is this one?
This is Alive. This is a one chapter from Cold Case that's designed not for you. I want you to learn it, but give it to somebody. This is an inexpensive tract that you can then give away.
Yes.
And that's the goal with that book.
Now, and in this book, a lot of what we've talked about today, and a whole ton more, is in this book.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate you having me on to talk about it, because I think I'm passionate, as you can see, and I know you are too, and I so respect that. Leon, I'm really glad to be on your show.
Well, every time we talk, I just feel like we're just kind of scratching the surface. So get the book, dive in, and thank you for being with me.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We'll be right back.